Gather round, brothers and sisters. Colonel Crank is here to tell you a few jokes. I am Colonel J. Crank, and I'm from Athens, Georgia. I hope you enjoy them. One of my buddies, old Joe Bob Peabody, he and his wife didn't have a lot to do. They kind of retired, and they're sitting on this big front porch, and both are rocking and just enjoying life. Joe Bob looks over at his wife, says, "Honey," says, "I killed 5 flies yesterday." She says, "Well, that's good. Good, Joe Bob." "Yep," says, "I got 3 female and 2 male." She looked at him like she was a little worried he may be having a problem. She says, "Why in the world do you think you got 3 female and 2 male?" He says, "I killed 3 on the telephone and 2 on a beer can." Joe Bob's one of my old buddies. We've been running around for a long time. He does a little flea market at this big flea market in Athens, Georgia with me. Another good buddy is old Roy Lee Horney. Well, Joe Bob and Roy Lee got together, and they bought this little pig. They put up $10 a piece, paid $20 for a little bitty pig, and they decided to raise him and have a big party one day when he got to be a big old hog and sell him. Take the money and invite all the friends and really have a blowout. Well, they got this little pig, and they fed him, and they looked after him, and all of a sudden they had a huge hog. And they carried him to the barn to sell him. And they started weighing him in, and he weighed 500 pounds. Then they began to auction him. And the hog bought 40 cents a pound. Well, I tell you, old Roy Lee, he was just delighted, and he says, "Man, that's $200 or more." Says, "We're going to have a big party." About that time, Joe Bob said, "No sale, no sale." Roy Lee said, "Joe Bob," said, "what's the matter with you, man?" Says, "That's $200 or more. We can have a heck of a party." He said, "Nah," says, "I heard on the news this morning," says, "hogs are bringing 45 cents a pound in Chicago." He says, "Chicago," says, "that's a long ways from here." He says, "Yeah, but," says, "what's time to a hog?" Then got the little story about old Roy Lee's wife. She went to the pet store one day, and she wanted to buy this pet. She wanted a parrot, always wanted a parrot, but they were $800,000, $1,200, $1,500, and she just couldn't afford it. So finally she kept asking the guy and checking the store every week or two, and he finally told her, says, "Madam," says, "I do have one parrot you can buy for $300, but," says, "I'm sure you don't want him." Says, "He was raised in a cat house." And she says, "Oh," says, "I can break him," says, "if he's pretty." And she went back and looked at him, just fell in love with the old parrot. He says, "Ma'am," says, "I don't think you want this parrot." Says, "Got a terrible vocabulary," and says, "You just really don't want this parrot." She says, "I can break him." Says, "Put him in a box. I want him." So she paid the guy and left the store and carried the parrot home, set him up on his little perch. And in just a few minutes, she bent over and started to get something out of the oven. And the old parrot says, "Ark, ark." Says, new madam." Well, she just goes over and pops the old parrot on his head and says, "Don't you ever call me a madam." Says, "I'm the lady of this house, and this is my house." Well, that kind of dazed the old parrot. He didn't say anything. A few minutes, here come her daughter running down the stairs. The old parrot looked around and says, "New girl on the block, new girl on the block." Boy, the old lady went over and smacked the parrot again, almost knocked him off his perch, and says, "That is my daughter." Says, "She is not a new girl on the block." Says, "This is my home, and that is my daughter, and don't you ever forget it." Well, about that time, they heard somebody at the front door. In come her husband. Old Parrot looked around and says, "Hi, Roy Lee. How you doing, Roy Lee?" Anyway, before Roy Lee retired, he worked at a furniture store. And one day he was polishing this big piece of furniture out on the back sidewalk, and this gentleman come by and says, "What is your name?" He says, "Roy Lee Horney." He says, "Well, Mr. Horney," says, "you look like a pretty good worker," says, "how would you like to come to work with me?" He says, "Well," says, "I might," says, "what you gonna pay me?" He says, "Oh," says, "I don't know," says, "I'll pay you whatever you're worth." He says, "Oh, no, sir," says, "I'm making more than that here already." So you probably figured out by now that my buddies and me are senior citizens. We get all those good discounts, drive around Athens all day long with our right blinker on. That's kind of why I like old folks' jokes. A lot of people ask me, says, "Where do you hear these jokes?" And I hear them, like I say, I flea market a lot. And here on Saturday and Sunday in Athens, people come by and they tell me all kind of jokes. And I've just picked them up over the years, and I enjoy telling them. So kind of pass them on to my friends, and you are one of my friends. Got to tell you one about the old doctor in town. That he had this friend that getting up in age in his 70s. And they were good buddies, and he was a good patient. One afternoon, the gentleman called the doctor and says, "Doc," says, "this is Henry," says, "can you work me in this afternoon?" Says, "Be honest," says, "I met a young lady. Said, we'd like to come down to your office and have sex." Doc thought to himself, "Dang, this is crazy. I never had this request before." But anyway, he says, "Well, yes," says, "come on down about 4. I'll work you in." Doc thought to himself as he hung up, says, "Oh boy, must have a problem. Maybe I can help him with it." Sure enough, that afternoon about 4, Doc saw Henry and this young lady go in one of his little rooms, and he was busy with another patient. In a few minutes, he got through. He went over to the door. The door was locked. Couldn't get in. He says, "Well, guess they undressing," says, "I'll just see another patient, and they'll be through in a minute." So Doc got tied up with another patient, and finally he got through, and he looked up, and he saw Henry down talking to his receptionist, and the young lady was leaving, and Henry was getting ready to go. So Doc rushed on down there and says, asked his receptionist, says, "What did Henry say?" Says, "I thought he had a problem." She said, "No, he said he owed you for an office visit, and he paid his bill and left." And he looked out in the parking lot, and the young lady was getting in the car, and Doc run out and caught Henry just before he got in and says, "Come over here." He says, "That was a strange request," and says, "I just got to thinking about it." Says, "I think you kind of hoodooed me on that." He says, "Tell me what's going on, Henry. We've been friends a long time." He says, "Well, Doc," says, "I'll just tell you how it is." Says, "The office visit in your office is $55. Says, Holiday Inn gets $75. But says, more important than that, says, Medicare pays 80% of your bill." So we got the 3 old fellows in a nursing home sitting around, and they all talking to each other one day. One of them says, "You know," says, "the worst thing can happen to you is you lose your eyesight." Says, "I can't read the paper and I can't see the television." Other one says, "Well," says, "that's pretty bad, but that's not near as bad as my problem." Says, "I'm losing my hearing." Says, "You know," says, "we can't hear what people are saying." Says, "I can't hear the radio, can't hear the TV, just have to watch a picture." Says, "That's the worst thing." Third little old gentleman says, well, says, both of those are bad, but says, neither one is as bad as what's happening to me. Says, I am losing my memory. He said, well, what's so bad about that? He says, well, says, y'all know that pretty little nurse that makes up our bed? Yeah. He said, well, says, I just hemmed her up in the corner the other day, and says, I just propositioned that young lady. And he says, she said, go on, old boy, says, you done had it. And he says, I don't remember it. Then there's the joke about the son that visited the elderly dad one day. And he went over and checked on the old man every morning. He was way up in years and doing pretty good, but getting a little feeble. He was examining his dad, and he noticed his dad seemed to be a little hard of hearing him, and he got to looking at his ears, and he saw something sticking out of the old man's ear. And he reached up to the old man's ear and pulled out a suppository. He says, Pop, says, what in the world is this suppository doing in your ear? He says, oh, hell, says, I know where my hearing aid is now. Joe Bob is full of wisdom and advice, you know. He says an expert's anybody over 50 miles from home. But you always got to watch whose toe you step on. It may be attached to the rear and you have to kiss later. So he's just full of all kind of good advice, especially for young people. People ask me all the time, says, where I hear this stuff, and it's just friends, folks. It's all free. It's out there. All you got to do is pick it up. But anyway, this little boy, he was cutting off puppies' tails one day. This man goes by and he cuts an inch off, and the little puppy squeals, and cuts another inch off, and the little puppy squeals. And this guy runs over to the old man and says, son, says, don't do that away, says, you're hurting that little dog, says, go ahead and cut the whole thing off. He says, oh, no, sir, says, he can barely stand it a little bit at a time. So that's the way some folks think. Sometimes I think, if this place was, if idiots could fly, this place would be an airport. But anyway, the little boy, he had the lawnmower out one day, pushing it down the road, and he goes by the preacher's house. Preacher looks at the little boy and says, what are you going to do with that lawnmower? He says, well, I'm going to go sell it. Preacher says, son, says, I've got a bicycle, says, I really could use a lawnmower, says, I'll trade you the bicycle for the lawnmower. So the little boy says, well, says, we can do that, says, I guess that'll be a fair trade. So little boy jumps on the back and goes around the block, and the preacher's pulling the lawnmower, trying to get it cranked. He goes back around the block, and the preacher's still pulling on the lawnmower, trying to get it cranked. Third time, the preacher flags the little boy down. He said, little boy, says, how do you crank this lawnmower? Little boy says, well, I never could get it cranked, so that's why I decided to sell it. He says, well, says, but the man that sold it to me, says, he told me, says, you had to kick it and cuss it and it'd crank. Preacher said, well, son, says, I don't do that. Says, it's been years since I've used profanity. Little boy says, well, says, just keep pulling that lawnmower. It'll come back to you. This little boy was playing with his train set one time. He was playing in the room next to the kitchen. His mother could hear him barely. Little boy says, all you SOBs want to get on the train, get on. All you SOBs want off the train, get off. And his mother heard him. She went in there and she popped him good and says, Johnny, don't you never say that again. Says, I just happened to be walking by and says, I heard you, and says, that's terrible. Says, don't want to hear that language no more. So she went on back to the kitchen, got rather busy, and she wasn't paying him any attention. A little while she went back to eavesdrop and see what he was doing. Little boy says, all you SOBs want to get on the train, get on the train. All you SOBs want off the train, get off the train. He says, due to the bitch in the kitchen, I'm running 30 minutes late. Roy Lee, that's my other flea marketing buddy, you know. He went home one night, and Roy's been known to take a drink or two. He got to feeling pretty darn good, and it was around midnight. And he fires up the stove and decides he wants some egg sandwich. So some way or another, gets the stove a little too hot, and the grease catches on fire, and it sets the kitchen on fire. Man, it is a roar. Roy Lee runs to the phone and dials 911 and tells the lady that answers, says, ma'am, my house is on fire. Says, get somebody out here in a hurry. Says, the kitchen ceiling is beginning to burn. She says, well, how'd I get to you? He says, don't y'all still have those little red trucks? If I told you about a pool of blood in the highway, and I told you that either a lawyer or a possum got killed in that pool of blood in the highway, how would you know which one it was? Well, it'd be skid marks in front of the possum. Why won't sharks attack lawyers in water? Professional courtesy. One of my all-time little favorite jokes was years ago. Y'all remember the telephone company had the big green trucks, and they were the only action in town. They were rather independent. I think my daughter paid like $200 for one of those little pink princess phones, like $1 a month or something forever. But anyway, they were a little on the independent side, and I had this old buddy, and his name was Rufus. He had a very bad speech impediment, and he was very sensitive about it. And he, one day, tried to call a friend in Atlanta. Back in, you had to do the rotary dial and go through the operator. He said, operator, then I want to call Atlanta, Georgia, Trenton 39976. She said, what, sir? He said, I want to call Atlanta, Georgia, Trenton 39976. She said, you're going to have to speak slower, sir. He said, operator said, damn it, I want to call Atlanta, Georgia, Trenton 39976. She said, I'm sorry, sir. Says, you're going to have to speak plain. Says, I still can't understand you. He said, operator, then you take the telephone and stick it where the sun don't shine. Well, she understood that. He didn't think any more about it. The next day or two, here comes his little green truck driving up. Two men in a suit and tie get out and come to the door and says, Mr. Rufus, is you the fellow that told one of our operators to take a telephone out and stick it where the sun didn't shine? Isn't that right? So I sure did. Said, well, we're a big company. Said, we're going to take your telephone out and carry it back with us unless you call operator 6 and apologize. Don't get excited. Me call, he said. He dialed. Operator 6? Yes, I am. He said, well, are you the operator I told to take this telephone and stick it where the sun don't shine? She says, yes, sir, I am. He said, well, you better get ready because two men down here in a suit and tie fixing to bring it to you. Old Joe Bob is in Chicago one time, walking down the street, and he goes by this bar, sees a sign in the door, says, "Drawing for free sex every hour on the hour." Man, that caught his eye. He had to spring for the price of a beer to see what that was all about. So he goes in this bar, and he's oohed and awed at the big city of Chicago anyway. He knows those Yankees are different. See what's going on up there. Man and very good-looking woman sitting next to him. The only ones in there beside him, and he has him a beer, and he orders another one. Finally, he pokes this guy on his left, says, "Sir," says, that sign out in the sidewalk out there says, "Drawing free sex every hour." Says, "That's a joke, isn't it? Just a promotion gimmick." Guy says, "Oh, no," says, that's for real." Says, "We do that." Says, "Oh," says, "You ain't ever won, have you?" He says, "No, I hadn't," but says, "My wife's won 3 times. So you have to hand it to those Yankees. They got a little ingenuity up there. Little boy one time asked his mama, says, "Mama," says, "how old are you?" She said, "Johnny," says, "that's none of your business." He says, "Mama," says, "how much you weigh?" She says, "Johnny," says, "you never ask a lady a weight or either how old she is." Says, "Don't ever do that again." Says, "Even girls," says, "they don't like to tell their weight and age." He said, "Well, Mama," says, "why did you and Daddy get a divorce?" She says, "Well, Johnny, that's a long story," and says, "I'll explain that to you when you get older." So they kind of ignore it, and finally the lady goes out in the yard, do a little yard work, and little boy's still curious how old his mother is, so he thinks about the driving license. So he goes and gets a pocketbook, and he gets a driving license out and reads it over carefully and studies it a few minutes and puts it back. A few minutes, his mother comes back in. He says, "Mama," says, "I think I know how old you are." She says, "Well, Johnny," says, "you so smart." Says, "How old am I?" He says, 48. She says, "Well, Johnny," says, "that's a good guess." Says, "You're lucky." Says, "I shouldn't tell you, but," says, "you're right." He says, "Mama," says, "I think I know how much you weigh." She says, "Well, Johnny," says, "how much do I weigh?" He says, 164. She says, "Wow, that is great." Says, Johnny, says, "You had to know something." Says, "How did you find that out?" He says, "Well, to be honest, Mama," says, "I looked at your driving license in your pocketbook." She said, "Well, Johnny, you shouldn't have done that at all." Says, "That's an invasion of my privacy." But says, "Since you've done it," says, "that's all right. That doesn't hurt anything." He says, "Mama," says, "I also know why you and Daddy got a divorce." She said, "Well, if you're so smart," Johnny, says, "why did we get a divorce?" He says, "Because you got a F in sex." My wife and I went to Maryland one time. I don't know why we got up there, but anyway, we went in this seafood restaurant. And this maitre d', I think they call him, came over and asked us how many in the party, and if we liked smoking and unsmoking. And we told him it was just 2 of us, and no smoking, and so he tells us to follow him. Well, just as we're sitting down at the table, my wife asked him, says, "Do y'all serve crabs in here?" He says, "Yes, ma'am." Says, "We serve everybody. Have a seat." "Roy Lee, get me out of here. I've started on the little lady, and that's a whole new record."